Starting. There we are. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first Digital Classics London seminar of the summer series. And so I'm Eleanor Robson. I'm one of the conveners, along with Gabi Bodard and Simona, and I've just blank on your surname, sorry, and Valeria Vitale. Stoyanova? Yep. Yes, thank you. Sorry, end of the week. So this is we'll be running throughout June and July, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome Zena Kamash as our first speaker. But before I do that, I'll just give a quick plug for next week's session, which will not be in here in this room, will be upstairs in room 234. There are flyers on the chair out there if you want it. Thibaut Claris will be speaking about Capitane's very important open source tool suite, and thinking about our theme of generalization and adoption of open source software for digital classics. But today, Zena is going to be talking about something rather different. So Zena Kamash is lecturer in Roman archaeology at Royal Holloway, and she started off as a kind of regular archaeologist, that's fair to say, kind of just normal Roman Britain and Roman North Africa and Middle East. And in the recent years, because of the conflicts in Syria and Iraq, has become increasingly concerned about the way in which the academic community responds to those tragedies, and situates her work very much within Middle Eastern communities, both in the region and also here in the diaspora communities in the UK. And so a lot of her most exciting work, for me at least, in the last couple of years has been reflecting on what digital humanities, digital classics can offer to that very serious human tragedy that has been unfolding over the last few years. And there have been lots of very knee-jerk responses to those tragedies, and a very simplistic idea that digitization is tantamount to preservation. Now, Zena, I think, will demonstrate things are a lot more complicated than that, and there are better and worse ways to go about those issues. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about that today, Zena. So I will stop talking now and hand over to you to tell us more. And then when you're ready, I will help you flick over to the slides. So,
thank you, Eleanor. It's a really lovely introduction. And thank you to the other organisers as well for inviting me to be here. Hopefully it will be enjoyable. This is a topic about which I probably could talk for 8 hours. So this will be quite a small part of some of my thinking, but we can explore it more in questions maybe.
If you want to
try and
go up
switch
here,
to slides.
Yeah, and that one, and then share, and then once it's going there, you just click over to your PowerPoint there. There we are. Okay. I will shut up.
I think we're doing that right. Thank you. Right. Okay. I think we have all the technology sorted. Right. So, as I said, this is a huge topic about which I could talk for hours, but I promise not to. So I'm going to talk about a particular section of it today. So I'm going to start off talking about a bit of a spat that developed between Factum Arte and the Institute of Digital Archaeology, who are two institutes who are involved in creating reconstructions. But I'm going to argue that their spat went off in the wrong direction, that we need to step back and think about a much more basic question, which is, why are we making these reconstructions? And very crucially, for whom are we making them? And I'm going to talk about what we mean by local people, and in the why bit, about recovery from trauma. My suggestion is going to be that we need to slightly shift what we do, and that shift could come from looking at creative practice. But before I start, I just want to acknowledge my many biases, because they do have an impact on how I think and what I'm going to argue. And I've stolen from Viejo Rose, who wrote about Reconstruction after the Spanish Civil War, and she described herself as an objective partisan. And that seems to reflect how I would view myself as well. So these are some of my biases. I'm an archaeologist, I'm a British Iraqi. This isn't a horrendous overshare. Well, it is, but there's a reason for it. I have PTSD, and hopefully you'll see throughout why that's important and how that's reflected in my thinking, particularly the fact that doing crafts really helps that. This is probably the wrong room to confess. I am not a techie. So if you've come here for a detailed technological explanation of how to create reconstructions, etc., I am not the right person to talk to you about that. I'm very interested in studying what people do with technology, but I cannot confess to be able to do it myself. All of this means that when I say the word we, I mean something quite specific by it. Because I'm both an insider and an outsider in different ways. So I slightly shift in my meaning between being an expert on something and also considering myself local. And in my mind, those two are not mutually exclusive, and you can be both. So also with the techie issue of not being a techie, the theme of this seminar series is standardisation and customisation, and I may use those words in slightly different ways to the way they were intended to be used. So in terms of standardisation, for example, I'm not really talking about kind of standardising database terminologies and things like that. So hopefully the way I use them will become clear as I go on. So I'm going to start with this spat between Factum Arte and the IDA, the Institute for Digital Archaeology. And I'm sure most of you in this room are familiar with this particular object. This is the replica arch made by, excuse me, the IDA that was set up in Trafalgar Square in April 2016. It's travelled around. It's been in Dubai, it's been in New York, Florence, Verona, and it has caused quite a lot of controversy, some of which I've written about. I don't have time now to go into all of the reasons why I don't like this arch, but you can read some of those in my World Archaeology article, which is a pinned tweet on my Twitter. So when this went up, or in fact just before it went up, Roger Michael, who is the director of the IDA, who specialises in a particularly American kind of bombast that we might associate with another well-known American. And he said, I think this might be the most exact reproduction of any kind of classical structure ever made. So these really grand claims. But strongly in here is his emphasis on it being exact. That they were having to choose between whether they put moss on it, etc. They're making all these difficult decisions. Also, he claims. He does do a complete 180 on this claim a bit later on, after he gets into the argument with Adam Lowe, and says that people are too worried about high resolution and accuracy. But certainly he starts off from that premise. And the spat comes when Adam Lowe, who is the head of Factum Arte, responds to it. And this is an interview from the New Yorker, but there's also a blog on the Factum Arte website that picks the arch apart. And Lowe refers to it as a sloppy stunt, and comments quite rightly about its size, although actually I think it's 2/3 rather than 1/3 the original size. The confusion there is there's no information available on the arch, so it's very difficult to know quite what the sizing issue is. But it is smaller than it was supposed to be. And it's inaccurate in all kinds of different ways. And Adam Lowe points this out. This is the link to his blog at the bottom there. So this is the original arch here, with the replica arch on that side and the blue to blue, red to red. So you can see very clearly that there's all kinds of detail missing. So here we have a capital which is blank in the replica, and this one up here is the one that Adam Lowe refers to as the artichoke, or some sort of fish scale. Certainly it really has lost some of the beauty that was in the original. And therefore the idea that this is the most exact reproduction ever made has to come into question. So all of this is true. But I'm going to say that it's all a bit of a red herring, this debate over accuracy, because what it takes us away from thinking about is some of the bigger underlying problems with the arch. Talking about accuracy still fetishizes the object and removes us away from thinking about people, to focusing solely on the archaeology. And it ignores a major underlying problem in my mind, which is the removal of the sense of place that should be part of this arch. And that takes us down a dangerous path of digital colonialism. And it does this in various different ways. So this is the place. This is Palmyra, Tadmor, in Syria. And one of the first things that you'll notice in the picture is how well the standing remains blend in with their landscape. And part of the reason for that is that the quarries for the site are located very closely to the site itself. Almost everything on the site is made from a local limestone. The arch, the replica arch, is made from Egyptian marble. So it's the wrong material, it's not even from Syria, it's from Egypt. So that's problem number one. So the place, the landscape that should be imbued within the object is missing. This is the arch, and you can see that it sits partway along a colonnaded street. And the street is not straight, so it comes from Diocletian's camp up here, heads towards a tetrapylon, where it shifts direction to miss a temple, and heads off towards the arch. The problem is the road really should be heading towards the Temple of Bel, which is that large building in the background. And what the arch does is actually a very, very clever thing architecturally. The arch is a wedge shape. And that means that as you approach it from either angle on the road, you always face it head on. You're never facing it at a funny angle. So it disguises that bend in the road. So it's a very clever piece of connective architecture to make the site flow a lot more easily. The fact that the replica arch is just the central arch and doesn't have its side arches and doesn't give you any sense of that wedge shape, either in the physical object itself or in the absolute lack of any contextual information that goes with it, strips all of that brilliance away from the arch. So in terms of the replica actually being Palmyrene at all, if we look to a very basic architectural description of the site from Browning, tells us the carved ornament is unmistakably Palmyrene. Well, we've already seen that half of that was missing. Carved detail again, and the purely architectural concept, half the glory of this arch, gone. So it's missing most of the major things that would actually connect it back to its site. And this was picked up in the postcard responses in the project that I ran alongside the arch in Trafalgar Square, with several responses commenting on actually how Western it feels. It shouldn't feel Western. It should feel like it's from Syria, like it's from Palmyra. So if we strip all of that sense of place away from it, we're also taking away that link to the people of Syria, and we're making it something completely different. And that, to me, is a big problem. And it's a problem because of this question. Why are you doing it, and for whom are you doing it? And for anybody in this room or watching this who might be thinking about doing any reconstruction projects, please sit and reflect, even just for a minute, about those two questions. And if you can't come up with a good enough answer, don't do it. So, crucially, what I'm talking about here is post-conflict reconstruction. If I was talking about other kinds of reconstruction, I might make a very different kind of argument. But this is very context-specific and specific to a very particular set of experiences. So my answer to why would be to aid recovery following conflict. This should be part of a reparation process, both for people suffering from individual trauma, but also in terms of building or rebuilding wider community bonds, bonds that have been shattered by suspicion, by people ripping their community apart and setting people against each other. Which is why the for whom bit just has to be the people most affected by the conflict. And that's not Adam Lowe, and that's not Roger Michael. That is the people from Syria and Iraq in this particular context. So this brings us to explore that little for whom question a little bit more. I'll come back to why in a little while. So normally the kind of easy question, the easy answer to for whom is to say, oh, well, it's for the local people. And that's right. But what is it that we mean by that? Because unless we know what we mean by that, we can't make sure that whatever we're creating caters for those people. Well, it isn't actually a particularly simple category, I think. If you say local people, it sounds like you're talking about one homogenous group of people, but often that is not the case for various reasons. So I think local people can both be those who are still in the place, but can also be people who are now displaced and far away from that place. Possibly, a bit like me, who have spent very little time in that place because of circumstance. But that doesn't mean they're not local in their hearts. And within that localness, there may be many different identities going on. So if, like me, you're Moslawi from Mosul in Iraq, you may also identify with being any of these other categories: Yazidi, Kurd, female, educated, etc., etc. And you might self-identify across lots and lots of different ones of those. So to use myself as an example, I'm British, I'm Iraqi, I'm Moslawi, Bristolian, Sunni, Christian, female, adult, educated, a little bit gobby, red hair. And not everybody is going to have the same little set. There's going to be lots of different combinations going on. And therefore, anything we make has to be able to cope with that multiplicity and has to be able to talk across many, many different experiences. So depending on all those different ways that you identify yourself, you will have also experienced that conflict in a different way. And that means that how you repair will also be slightly different in the hope of finding those bonds of sharing again. So this has implications for seeking consensus, and I should say here and confess that I have probably myself at some point, in fact I may even in the World Archaeology paper, said that what we need is to seek consensus. Well, I've had a slight change of heart on that. And the reason I've had a slight change of heart is that I think that pushes us down a standardisation route, a one-size-fits-all, that there is some magic thing out there that everybody will be happy with. But I think that's almost certainly impossible. If you think about all those different ways of constructing your identity, the likelihood of getting all of those different identities to all agree on one thing, I think is probably impossible. And I'm not even sure that it's desirable. Here, slightly randomly, the pigeons of Thesaurus wearing toast. This is normally what's said about the opposite of consensus, that's conflict, it's disagreement, dissent, etc., etc. Which is why normally consensus is said to be desirable. But you could view this in a slightly different way. Consensus could also be stifling diversity, stifling difference. And often that is what has caused conflict in the first place. One set of people demanding that another set of people behave in exactly the same ways that they do, and having to view the world from their point of consensus. So instead, our little pigeon can come up with a slightly different definition. The opposite of consensus instead could be creativity, diversity, multivocality, embracing difference. And that puts it in a very different complexion. And I would also say here, and it's quite difficult for me to say, that we need to include all voices in whatever solution we may come up with, including those that we may not agree with, including those that may have caused some of the conflict in the first place. I'm going to use an example from Bosnia, and I apologise if I pronounce any of these names incorrectly. This is the Slana Banja memorial. And Tuzla was the site of a terrible massacre in 1995. And the city authorities at the time decided that they would bury everybody together, not separate people out by religion. And this was quite a controversial decision to make. As a consequence, this memorial, which had been a World War II memorial, shifted in its focus. The parts that were catered towards World War II have gone lower down in terms of emphasis, and instead there are new monuments in the space. And the overriding theme behind these commemorative monuments is about anti-nationalism, it's about multi-ethnic futures. And I suspect most of us in this room would probably think this is a very, very good idea. And indeed it is. We all want, hopefully, a multi-ethnic future. But a problem with it is that it doesn't speak to one quite large sector of the community. Those who are ethnic nationalists and are more religion inclined don't find themselves in this monument. And there's potential then for memorials such as this to become a site of future conflict, as a site where people feel their voice is not being heard and isn't being included. So this isn't achieving that desire to rebuild community bonds. It's just cutting one set of people out. So, on to why. So memorials like the one at Slana Banja, indeed all memorials are to do clearly with memory. But most people, I find, when they write about memorials, when they put memorials up, work on a model of normal memory, of what we might call narrative memory. Narrative memory is the sort of memory that most of us experience in our daily lives. And it has various features. It's very flexible. Memories often shift around. In that sense, they can often be not that reliable. So they can have elements added into them that may not have been in the thing that originally happened. The classic fish was this big and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. They're very social. We can share our memories. We often can develop collective memories. That's one reason in which they can shift around and become less connected to what may have originally happened. And they're often very easy to evoke. It's not difficult for me to think about what I did on my summer holiday. And I can think about my summer holiday and think about that one small part of it without having to go through my entire summer holiday from beginning to end. And I can share that very easily with anybody who wants to talk to me. I had a brilliant summer holiday. Went to Bosnia. In contrast, traumatic memory is almost the direct opposite. It's a very, very different kind of memory, very different in terms of its texture and in how it feels to experience that memory. Unlike narrative memory, it's almost entirely inflexible and invariable. It does not change. Every single detail of that memory will be exactly the same every single time. And that's partly because it's not being incorporated into the same part of your memory as narrative memory. So it often feels like it's present rather than past. The reasons for that is normally when it's happened, either something very dramatic and very quick has happened, so you just haven't been able to process it fast enough, or it's been so horrifying that you just shied away from it and you don't allow yourself to process it. So you never put it in the past. It's extremely solitary. It's very difficult to share a traumatic memory. So it's not a social engagement. If my holiday had been a terrible holiday, I would not want to talk about it to anybody. But if I did, I'd have to go through it, talk about it from the beginning, every single step in extreme detail until I got to the end of it. And if someone stops you in the middle of telling that memory, you don't feel good afterwards. They're also evoked under very particular conditions. You can't recall them at will, often. So this is how you end up having things like flashbacks and nightmares, so memories come upon you at times you're not expecting them. And it's almost like you've suffered from amnesia, because you just cannot remember, because you've gone through this process of repressing it so far out of access that there are whole chunks of time often just missing. So this is very, very different to this. So when we do things that involve memories and memorialization and commemoration, I think we need to do a lot more work around thinking about what this is like and how the things that we're doing to commemorate can help us move back towards a more narrative memory. And that is possible. You don't have to stay in this traumatic memory zone forever. So some of the ways that you can make that shift, some of the ways that you can use therapy, are that you need to complete the action. That might be returning to the place where something has happened, in particular to see that time has moved on. So that idea that this is still present and in your mind feels like nothing has changed. If you can go and see that trees have grown, something else has happened in that place, you can start doing that process of putting it back into the right part of your brain. So one of the ways, for example, that this has been done is also not necessarily to go physically back to the place. This was therapy carried out with a Holocaust survivor from Auschwitz. What they were asked to do was to think about their assignment place, which would be a part of the beginning of their trauma, and instead to imagine it with a flower growing in it. So to change the texture of that memory and to bring something more positive in it. And that's a very successful mode of therapy because it introduces flexibility. Once you've got flexibility back in your memory, you're moving away from traumatic memory and back into narrative memory. So imagining alternatives can be a really powerful way forward. And that, I think, is what we need to do by moving away from standardisation towards customisation, to things that are more imaginative and more flexible. So all of that's been very theoretical. So to some examples that demonstrate what I mean by this. I'm a firm believer that artists and creative practitioners have a wonderful way of looking at the world, and we can use their way of looking at the world to shift how we look at the world and to think about how we can do things in a different way, and in particular in this case, how we can think about reconstruction in a different way. So back to this again. So here we are, back in Trafalgar Square. Now I want us to focus on this plinth. This is the fourth plinth. At that time, it has an animal skeleton on it. But now, it has this rather wonderful thing. So this is Michael Rakowitz's Lamassu sculpture. It's still in Trafalgar Square. If you've not been to see him, go and give him a visit. He's a very beautiful thing. And particularly go on a sunny day, because he glows, he's stunning. And what is very interesting about this particular sculpture is, although it sits in the same space, which was so problematic for the replica arch, this Lamassu is wondrous in this space. He fits perfectly. By a wonderful coincidence, the footprints of the original Lamassu is exactly the same as the footprint of the fourth plinth, so we have things that are at the right scale. He has majesty, he can hold his own in this space. He is not in any way put off by the other monuments. If anything, he outshines them all. He is also, and crucially, not trying to be like the original. There are many ways in which this Lamassu deviates from the original. One of them being his cuneiform inscription, which instead of being impressed into the sculpture, sticks out from it. So Rakowitz has played with all of these ideas and is just not trying to make it look like the original. And the other thing where I think it competes and wins over the replica arch is in its materiality as well. So I don't think you can read this very clearly, but what this particular part says is Iraqi date syrup. So the entire sculpture is made out of cans from the date syrup, the Davis industry in Iraq, which itself is a disappearing part of Iraqi heritage. It's a very clever sculpture. It makes us think not just about traditional forms of heritage in the form of archaeological sites, but also more intangible kinds of heritage in terms of current industries that are disappearing rapidly. So it has a heart and a cleverness to it, and a depth of thought that is lacking in every way from the replica arch. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. If I can be so bold, I will make one critique of it, which in the context of what we might be trying to do with reconstruction is that this is one person's vision. And what I would like to see instead are things that are more participatory. So in my own small way, I've tried to do a little bit of that in my Remembering the Romans in the Middle East and North Africa, or short retro project. And this took place in 2016, exactly the same time that the replica arch was up. And the whole point of this project was that it was participatory. There were 4 workshops, 2 in the Petrie Museum in London and 2 in the Great North Museum in Newcastle. And each workshop lasted a day, and I was supported by a wonderful team of creatives, Sarah Ekdawi, who's a creative writing specialist, Miranda Creswell, who's an artist, and Rory Carnegie, who's a photographer. And people who came to the workshops were invited to choose any object they wanted from the museum, and the Petrie Museum. We were there on days it was closed, so people had the entire space to themselves, or they could select objects from a pre-selected selection. Very poor bit of phrasing, which you can see here in Newcastle. And then people could choose whichever object they wanted. They could choose whichever medium they wanted, be it writing, drawing, or photography, to respond to that object in a way that was meaningful to them. You can see some of the things that people created stuck up on the wall here in the Great North Museum, and over here, this is the Petrie Museum. People happily beavering away. I don't know what I'm pointing at. That's going to take something. A year after these workshops happened, I invited everybody who had been part of them to reflect on what had happened, and together we wrote a small journal article. And that was people contributed to it who were curators, who were the creatives, my wonderful MA students who helped on the project, and people who came and participated. And the responses were wonderful, and it really buoyed me up to read all of them, but particularly this one from Heba, which made me think, yes, I've done the right thing, this works. It makes people feel more empowered. They can do what they want to do with these objects without feeling that there's a particular way that you should do something. There's no proper way of responding. You can respond however you want. Heba's response was a postcard that she wrote to Nefertiti. And in order to see that, you have to go and read the article, which is in the wonderful Epoiersen, which is an open access online new journal for creative engagements with history and archaeology. And there's so much brilliant stuff in that journal. So go and look at it, support it. So we're gradually getting to the digital. So this is the digital end of what people are doing. And this is work by a US-based Iranian-born artist, Morehshin Allahyari, who describes herself as an art activist. And she's created a series of 3D printed sculptures called Material Speculation, and they're pieces from Hatra and Nineveh. And she did this deliberately as a response to two things. One was the destruction of these objects, but also the digital colonialism that she felt was present in other reconstructions. And she explicitly talks in interviews about feeling that there is digital colonialism right through the IBA's art and its projects. She does various clever things with her sculptures. One that I really love is that contained within them are flash drives with images, maps, videos showing different stages of these objects. And that puts time right at the heart, time and biography right at the heart of these sculptures. And that sense of needing that time, needing to understand that biography in order to recover from trauma, I think is a really clever part of them. The other thing that she does that is crucial in terms of making it not just about one person is that her code is open data. So if you want to, you can download her code and you can print these sculptures yourself. And in that, you can also look at a Syrian project, hashtag New Palmyra, which does a much better version of what the IDA are doing, but doesn't get as much publicity. So their code is also entirely open access, and they explicitly say in interviews that what they would love to see is people printing off, one of the things they've done is the tetrapylon from Palmyra. They'd love to see people print it off. You can print it in a different color. You can do whatever you want with it. You can make it your own. And I think that's the really key part of this. people can take ownership of these objects that in many cases have been violently taken away from them. So again, in a small way, I'm trying to reflect on this and bring in an increasingly participatory aspect to it. So this is a project that hasn't happened yet, but that will happen over the summer, and it's very generously funded by the British Institute for the Study of Iraq and by the Institute of Classical Studies. And what it takes is the idea of craftivism that I started thinking about when I was doing the retro project, which is that it's possible as an individual, when it often seems that there's nothing you can do as an individual, you can make little gentle acts of protest through craft. You can do something that changes the world in a very little and very gentle way without being a big, well-funded institute. So what I'm hoping to do in this project is to take digital models that were crowdsourced following the destruction of Mosul Museum and that have been made available through Project Mosul, which is now called Reconstruction, to take those digital models and to reimagine them, rematerialize them in textiles. And I'll be joined by a brilliant artist, Karen Celestine. And this makes sense in my mind in all sorts of ways, because it allows people that sense of craftivism, of doing something, even if it's a very small thing, but it also fits really neatly into a very long history of textiles and textile production in Mosul and the surrounding area. And I claim in no way to be a Michael Rakowitz, but this is my lamassu, needle felted in the colours of the Iraqi flag. And he may not be a wonderful piece of art that belongs in Trafalgar Square, but he's my lamassu, and I love him. So, in conclusion then, this is what I've been trying to argue. That reconstructions have to be customisable, that in order to fulfil the needs to help trauma and traumatic memory, they have to have that flexibility inbuilt where they can speak to individuals and to small groups of people. And in so doing, need to be creative and imaginative. And you can do that in all sorts of ways. I certainly have nothing against the digital. So if people have a 3D printer and want to print off a tetrapylon that's bright pink, go for it, brilliant. But if, like me, you spend your evenings knitting, then come and join one of my workshops and do something more crafty instead. And what I think is really good about the workshops is that they allow that multivocality to come out. They're participatory. Everybody can join in, whoever wants to join in. And overall, what doing this does is it makes it about people and not things. We put people back at the heart of why we're making these reconstructions. And I've just put in brackets down at the end there, something that reconstructions don't need to be, which is be put back on site necessarily. So what you might have noticed every time when I do my projects, they're often quite small. They're for people to keep. They don't have to be big public art projects. They can just be something very personal. There's a whole other hour about why I think things shouldn't go back on site, but I'll spare you that for now. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow, Zena, thank you. That's amazing. Familiar, unfamiliar, very exciting, sort of challenging ideas there. Before we go into questions, do we normally switch off at this point, or do we let this roll?
I would probably switch off just because we can't pick up everybody.
Yeah, so Goodbye, online folks.
Bye.
Thank you
Thank you
so
for
much
listening.
for listening. We're going to let you go now. If I can. There we are. No, that's
I
not
don't
it.
know why I waved the camera wasn't on.
I'm not that. What am I doing? No, I don't. Do I? I'm being completely useless now at this point. What am I looking for?
Probably the fifth one.
Yes.
Yeah, stop broadcasting.
Bye, folks.